Hey everyone, and welcome back. This is Catherine from the Bishes Stitches Knitting Podcast channel. Today we are continuing with our tutorials from the School of Knitting. Just real quick, if you're interested in seeing future videos about knitting, about sock knitting, please subscribe to this channel. And if you like this video today, please give us a thumbs up. So let's get started. As I mentioned, we are going to go over some more techniques that pertain to sock knitting. In the last tutorial, we spoke about the heel flap, and today we're going to work on turning the heel. So if you refer back to the last video where we did the heel flap, or maybe just a quick review, we basically knitted out our heel flat from right to left on both sides. So basically, basically back and forth. So I ended the last row forward, or the front part of the heel flap, and now I'm going to continue with turning the heel. Just a quick info when you're turning the heel, or rather how you divide your stitches for turning the heel. You always base the division on the amount of stitches you have on the needles. So for example, I have 31 stitches on this needle, and I'm going to technically divide it in half. So what I could do is either do 16 stitches or I can do 15 stitches. It doesn't really matter. So like the heel flap, the first thing you want to do is pick up the first stitch purlwise, and then you're going to knit, as I mentioned, 15 or 16 stitches. So 1, 3, 4, 6, 7, 9, 10, oops, 11, 12, 13, 14, and so now I have 15. So once I've reached the 15th stitch, I'm going to do an SSK. So I'm going to pick up the first stitch purlwise, the second stitch purlwise, and now these two stitches are on my right hand needle, and now I'm going to take my left hand needle and I'm going to put the needle in the front. So, and then I'm going to knit these stitches together. Okay, so then I'm going to knit one more stitch, and then I'm going to turn my work. So just as shown. So now I've turned my work, and now I'm going to pick up the first stitch purlwise again. And now I'm going to purl about 5 stitches across. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so now I'm going to purl the next 2 stitches together, and then I'm going to purl the next stitch, and then I'm going to turn my work again. So basically we're going to keep doing this until we have basically all stitches worked. So again, you pick up the stitch and you knit until you meet the next point on the needles where there's a little bit of a gap. In the beginning, it's a little bit tricky to notice the gaps that are there, but as soon as you become a little bit more seasoned in sock knitting and turning the heel, you definitely see it. So here we are already, where you see this big gap. So now I'm at this big gap, and I know that I have to basically SSK these stitches together. So just a quick review. When you're closing this gap, whether that's on the front or the back, when you have the right side of the yarn or the right side of your work, you're always going to do an SSK, and when you have the wrong side of your work, you're going to do a purl together. And then I'm going to knit the stitch, and then I'm going to turn. So now I've got the wrong side of my work. I'm going to pick up the stitch, and now I'm going to purl until I find my gap that I created on the right side of the work from applying the SSK. Okay, so we're gonna keep purling, like I said, until we make it to our gap. And again, we're on the wrong side of the work. So I've made it to the gap. Now I'm going to purl these 2 stitches together, because again, on the wrong side of the work, you purl these 2 stitches together, and then you purl 1 more stitch, and then you turn your work. So you basically do that until you have absolutely no more stitches here on the sides to work. So I knitted a little bit ahead. Again, I am on the right side of my work. I've made it to my gap, and now I'm going to SSK these stitches together. And then I'm going to knit 1 more stitch, and then I'm going to turn my work. So again, I'm going to pick up the stitch, and I'm on the wrong side, so all the stitches are purled. Well, now I'm going to purl my way until I meet my gap again that I created on the other side, or on the right side of the work. And now I've made it to my gap. I'm going to purl these 2 stitches together and purl 1 and turn my work again. So I will show front and back again, and then I will meet you back once once I've basically knitted all the stitches. So again, you pick up the stitch and you knit across until you meet your gap. So now I am approaching my gap. There it is right there. And then I'm going to SSK, because like I said, when you're on the right side, you SSK your gap together. And then you knit 1 stitch, and then you turn your work. So now we're gonna do the wrong side 1 more time. I'm going to pick up the first stitch purlwise and purl my way across to the gap. So we're almost there. Okay. So I've now made it to my gap. I'm going to purl these 2 stitches together, and then purl 1 stitch, and then I'm going to turn my work. Okay, so I'm going to basically finish up the stitches on the side, but just as a side note, while you're turning the heel, you start to notice that there's this ridge that starts to be formed, and then you know that you're basically on the right path. So see you guys in a minute. Okay, so I'm almost finished working all of my stitches, and I thought it would be important to jump back on for this point. I am currently working the wrong side of the heel flap, and before I close the gap, I just wanted to touch base on a very important step. So at some point when you're working your stitches and you're coming towards the end, you will end up with a gap that looks like this. Okay, this happens one time and it only happens at the end when basically all the stitches are close to being completely worked. So, so far I've mentioned when I have a gap, I purl the stitches together when that's the wrong side, and when that's the right side, that's the SSK. So since I'm on the wrong side, I'm going to purl these stitches together as I mentioned. Okay, and this time you notice that I don't have any other stitch to stitch like I did in the last time. I stitched the stitches together, whether that's an SSK or a purl, to close the gap, and then I always knitted or purled one stitch more. But since I don't have any other stitches to work, I just closed the gap by purling these two stitches together. So now I'm going to turn my work again. So I turned my work, and as usual, I'm going to pick up the first stitch and knit my way across until I've met the gap. So knitting across. So almost there. And this is one of the funnest parts of knitting socks, but also one of the parts where you really need the most concentration, especially for the beginning or as a beginner. So we're almost to the gap. So sometimes that can happen that on one side you have a few more stitches left over than on the other side. As long as that's a stitch or two, that's really not a problem. So I will also show you here how one then would react to that. So like I said, we have the right side of the heel flap. We're going to SSK the stitches together to close our gap. So I'm going to complete this SSK. I'm going to knit one stitch, and then I'm going to turn my work again. So I worked all the stitches on the right side. Now I'm back to the back of the heel flap, and as you see, everything worked out perfectly. But when you're continuing with the sock, you've turned the heel and then you're going to begin the gusset, you should always make sure that when you're done turning the heel, that you always end up on the right side of the work. So I worked the right side, I've ended up on the wrong side, and now I have to basically purl once across. So almost to the end. Oops. And then I purl the last stitch, and then I turn my work, and then I'm ready to start with the gusset. So that's all for today. Thank you so much for tuning in and for watching our tutorial on turning the heel. If you're interested in seeing what happens next, please subscribe to this channel, and if you liked what you saw today, please give us a thumbs up. Thanks so much and take care. Bye-bye.